Once again, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the High School Climate Change Symposium. Um, Again, I'm Elijah Fox, and today I would like to welcome our speaker for this session, Dr. Lily Odarno. Dr. Odarno is the director of the Clean Air Task Force's Energy and Climate Innovation Program in Africa. And she leads the CATF's effort to address the dual need for expanding affordable energy in developing economies and building a global decarbonized energy system. Her work focuses on development-centric energy transition pathways, utility markets, and technology innovation for low-carbon energy development in Africa. Once again, please ask your questions in the chat, and we will have time to ask them at the end of the presentation. And please note that this session is being recorded. With that said, Dr. Odarno, thank you again for coming and sharing your knowledge with us today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Elijah, and the whole planning team. Thanks for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to be here. Very honored to have an opportunity to share a few thoughts with the next generation of leaders. So today I'm going to be talking about Africa's energy transition. I know you have a number of topics in the climate change space, but I'll be here talking about climate change from the perspective of Africa and specifically focusing on Africa's energy systems and questions around the energy transition, some of which some of you may be familiar with or not. But what I hope to do with today's discussion is to be able to help us all appreciate the uniqueness of the context that shape energy transitions discussions, but also efforts on the African continent, how that is very, very different from what we may be familiar with in the United States or in Europe or in more advanced economies, and what that means for how we think about climate action when we focus on developing economies. So I hope at the end of the talk, I'll be able to have raised some critical issues and questions that help us to think about these topics. So really quickly, just setting some context for those who may not be familiar with climate change and climate science and why we talk about energy systems in that context. A lot of the leading agencies, environment, climate, have acknowledged the fact that our energy systems play a key role in driving climate change. Fossil fuels, specifically coal, oil, and natural gas, are known to be the largest contributors to global climate change, accounting for over 75% of global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. According to NASA, the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas has increased the concentration of atmospheric CO2. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also acknowledges that we need to make significant shifts in our energy system for us to be able to address or even stop catastrophic climate change. But if you look at the picture of our global energy supply today, you realize that we are still very, very dependent on fossil fuels. As a civilization, between oil, coal, and gas, still 80% of energy supply is dependent on fossil fuels. We are seeing a growing but still small role of other cleaner energy sources. We are still very, very fossil-based as a civilization. And the interesting thing is that this story hasn't changed much over the last, I would say, 30 years. So in 1995, with the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, that was actually the first global effort to address climate change through what we now know as the UN Convention for Climate Change. We really haven't moved from the dynamics of our energy supply and energy use from 1995 till today. So you realize that fossil fuels were about 80% of our energy supply then. Is still around the same today. What happened is that we have grown the base because we are consuming more, but we are still very, very dependent on fossil fuels. So in line with that, global emissions have been rising since the 1940s. As far as this graph goes, we saw a little dip during the COVID period when there was a halt almost in the global economy, but we are now seeing again a rise in global emissions. And we need to do a lot of work to be able to drive down those emissions. By 2050, we should be able to drive down emissions to what we call a net zero status for us to be able to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, which is what the IPCC identifies as basically the safest allowable increase in atmospheric temperature above pre-industrial levels that we can accommodate as a civilization to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. So a lot of work has to be done for us to be able to drive down those emissions. So that's the global story in terms of, and that's why we are here talking about climate change. Now, a bit about climate action in Africa, why it's different, why we should think very, very differently about it, and what that means for how we think about climate response. I'll start by setting out the scene, giving some context about Africa. So as a region, the continent has the lowest level of energy use per capita. So energy use per capita is referring to the average amount of energy that an individual is using on the continent. You took the total amount and then divided by the population. So per capita energy use is very low. It's the lowest in compared to every other part of the world today. And the UN is projecting, and actually other organizations now are now having quite accurate predictions that by the turn of the century, we are going to have about 4 billion people living on the African continent, which will be up to 40% of the globe's human footprint by 2100. What that means is that by 2100, one of every 3 people that you meet will likely be African. Now, we on the continent, we are also faced with very, very critical poverty and underdevelopment challenges. So currently, 80% of the global population without access to electricity are found within the African continent. If you take the group of countries that are considered least developed countries in the world today, 33 out of the 46 that we have today are found within the African continent, specifically within sub-Saharan Africa. Now, when we look at other indicators of development, so from health, education, sanitation, economic growth, infrastructural development, when we look at all those indicators as well, you realize that the African continent and specifically sub-Saharan Africa is lagging behind the rest of the world in all of these indicators as well. Now, in terms of the emission story, despite what we've seen with the low consumption, growing population, and all of that, Africa is also historically has contributed the least to global climate emissions, which is understandable because energy consumption there is very, very low. But at the same time, it's also one of the regions that is most vulnerable to climate change because we are still very, very dependent on rain-fed agriculture, for instance, as the foundation of most African economies. And so shifting variations in weather and in climates tend to have a huge impact on our economies. So we are the most vulnerable to climate change. It's estimated that the continent is losing out for anywhere from $5 to $7 billion annually to the impacts of climate change alone. And that's significant for the African continent. Now, this is an analysis that my team did, just looking at how CO2 emissions within Africa compares to the rest of the world, right? So if you go back we took data back to the 1960s, you see that there's been, kind of a steady growth in emissions within sub-Saharan Africa. But when you place this against what's happening in a more global context, right? What's happening in a global picture, or even with the OECD looking at those advanced economies, you realize that basically the continent's emissions have been flat over the years. And it's really significantly low compared to what we see in other parts of the world, both in the advanced economies, but also when we look at, at total global figures of CO2 emissions. Now, Africa's sectoral emissions are very different from that of Western countries, and this is an important distinguishing factor that we should keep in mind as we go down to talk about some of the solutions that we have in mind. When you look at the US and Europe, basically the lion's share of emissions in these regions is coming from the energy sector. In Africa, it's a different story. And I think there's a little, I think that I just realized there's a mistake with the legend. But in Africa, most emissions are coming from land use change and forestry and from the agricultural sector. So that's the bluish one and then the green one. So those are the two sectors which are driving emissions in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is because of where economies stand and what's actually driving the economies in those places. One, which is agriculture, and two, because most Africans are still very, very dependent on burning inefficient biomass for energy because access to electricity is low, so you can't electrify cooking easily. And so most Africans are still depending on that. So that dynamic is very, very different. What is actually driving what we see, the emissions on the continent is different. And it's important because it is very, very connected to where the continent stands in terms of its overall economic development. Again, African regions are not homogeneous. I know that many people sometimes talk about Africa as, as though it was one country, but we have 54 countries, very, very different across the regions from east to west to south to central and North Africa. You come across vast, vast differences in culture and economies, but also in the structure of energy systems. And so you realize that those areas where we really need to focus on or even actually talk very deeply about, what it means to clean up a grid are usually like places like in West Africa, in North Africa, in South Africa. In Central Africa and East Africa, because there are vast amounts of renewables, hydro, geothermal in Kenya, in the East African Rift Valley area. So they tend to have a lot of cleaner energy sources to draw on. And so Africa is not one, it's not homogeneous, and we can't have a singular energy transition strategy for the region because of these differences across the regions and in terms of the resource endowment. Again, Africa expects to grow. The story is not great so far in terms of where we stand with access to modern energy, with economic development, with access to a lot of the critical infrastructure that we should have as a continent. But the region expects to grow. By 2050, we are estimating that there could be some 2.5 billion people living on the African continent. I mentioned initially that by the turn of the century, there could actually be about 4 billion people. And we are seeing a huge demographic shift. Africa is moving from being largely rural to being largely urban. And that has implications for how you provide energy and what that means if you have a concentrated urban population and are not able to meet energy needs in the context of even a changing climate and what that does to weather and disease incidents and all of that. We also expect to see an increase in investment in manufacturing, up to about 43% by 2030. We kind of were rethinking this a little bit with COVID, but we may be on track to be able to see, that growth in investment. Household consumption is growing, could increase by about 2.3% by 2030. And certainly we need to see an increase in electricity demand to be able to meet any of these needs at all. And so what that means is that we are seeing basically the African continent facing a number of potential futures, right? So to speak, we could call them pathways and all of that. And each of them come with specific potential impacts. So we could have a scenario where the continent continues to grow as it is and develop as it is, low energy consumption, and what that means is that we are going to dramatically increase the number of the world's poor, right? We are thinking of 2.5 billion people by 2050. If we can't meet energy needs and we see population still growing, we are dramatically potentially going to increase the number of the world's poor. A second scenario could be that we see a substantial increase in per capita energy consumption as African economies grow, but if this is driven by conventional fossil technology to a large extent, then we are going to see a rise in emissions, right? And then the third scenario could be that we see a substantial increase in per capita energy growth, which is combined with the uptake of zero carbon technology options. So then you are thinking about developing within climate limits. I think that in the climate space, most people like to think about the fact that, that third scenario is where you want to see African countries land. And sometimes what we hear is that, oh my, the African continent has so much solar potential. It's going to be able to achieve this in the shortest possible terms. But is that possible? It's not a pathway that is going to happen without a lot of very, very fundamental and transformative shifts in several areas. And so I want to touch on, some of in our work and some of the work I've done over the years, what I see as some of the key barriers to actually us being able to achieve, climate impact on the African continent the way we hopefully would want to have it. And so I'll talk a bit about, Africa's energy transformation. And I picked the word transformation here very, very intentionally because as I mentioned in the previous slides, we see that there are regions actually within the African continent where access to electricity is so low, 20%, 30%. And so even when we talk about the energy transition in those regions, there's even nothing to transition from. And so maybe what it actually is a broader energy transformation, but there are some critical barriers to that. And so I want to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about knowledge generation, I'm going to talk about infrastructure, and I'm going to talk about finance. So on the knowledge generation piece, one of the biggest questions we are grappling with now is whether knowledge about Africa and about Africa's energy transformation or energy transition or about climate action in general in Africa is being externally led. So we've done a careful look at, how investments in R&D, innovation, just knowledge generation on the continent in general. And we find that, consistent with, with what we've seen with the other development sectors, Africa is just accounting for about 1.1% of global investments in research and development today. And even though the continent is, we have 15% of the world's population living on the African continent today, the actual research output from the continent is just about 2%. And so when you compare the number of researchers per million people in Africa to places like the US or UK, you have about 198 researchers per million people compared to about 4,000 plus per million people in the US and the UK. So there's a knowledge generation gap. And recently my team did an analysis. We went back to try to understand, who is actually shaping knowledge about Africa's energy transition. Is it Africans themselves? Like, who is actually driving this knowledge development process? And so we took a huge sample of peer-reviewed papers on energy transitions in Africa. We scaled them down to 156, and then we worked through a number of dynamics. But one of the key things that we found was that, in fact, most of the knowledge around Africa's energy transitions in the climate context is being produced, they don't even have an African-based author at all, on that knowledge that's being generated. So it's really an externally led research agenda in that sense. Over 60, you see 63%, have no Africa-based author at all. And so when we see how these papers are also represented or these knowledge products are represented in key spaces like the IPCC reports, which guide how we think about, our climate response, is the same. Papers which are cited are mostly papers which are externally written about, with authors based outside of the continent completely. And so there's a huge gap in terms of the knowledge development process and how we can indigenize that a bit more. And the reason why that is important, particularly when it comes to climate and energy, is that the issues with climate and energy are so local that you need to be able to build that local knowledge and make sure that it's feeding into policies, it's feeding into strategies, and it's feeding into how you think about the energy systems that work for you. What are the cultural factors that shape how people behave? And how does that affect how they interact with nature and with their environmental systems, with energy systems? And how do we bring that into a strategy for energy transformation within the African continent? So that's one on knowledge. The second point I want to make is on infrastructure and markets. And I see that as, the second critical gap that stands in the way of, of us thinking about solutions to, or actually climate action strategies, which are well suited for the African context. I mentioned in my earlier comments that, one of the assumptions we make when we talk about um, transforming energy systems in Africa is that we just assume that, hey, the region has so much. Look at all the sun and how hot it is on the African continent. If you just spread out a solar array over the continent, look, we would be done with the climate challenge. But it's not as easy as that. There are very serious infrastructural challenges within the African continent today, which make it difficult for us to be able to actually roll out, this utopian future, which most of us would hope we could actually achieve. And much of it is actually related back to underdevelopment and the lack of infrastructure and to finance to a large extent. So here we have two graphs. So basically, when you have an energy system, let's say you built out a power grid, and most of it is actually dependent on coal, right? And now you are a highly developed economy. Your demand is very, very predictable because we know you have these industries, so you have a very, very predictable demand structure. You have a well-developed economy. The main challenge there is that your energy system is not clean. Maybe it's based on coal or gas or something like that, or on oil, and you want to shape, basically redo that or remake that and make it much more renewable. That is a story that we have, or that we see in the advanced economy. So you talk about the US, you talk about Europe, that's the story, right? You have a well-developed grid, you have energy sources which are not clean, and we are trying to change that. You have demand, which is very predictable because economies have matured and well-developed. So we have what we call a horizontal transition. All that you are doing is basically trying to change the composition of, your energy supply. Now, what we see in the developed world and in places like Africa is what we call a vertical transition. So first of all, the power systems themselves don't even exist, or are not well developed. Grid infrastructure is outdated. Much of it is not built out yet. And you have demand, which is also not mature because economies are not, industrialization is still basically picking up in some of the African countries. And so we don't have that matured economy, matured demand, predictable demand. We don't even have that. So what you're trying to do in that sense is that whilst you are thinking about how you shift the composition of the energy supply sources from dirtier fuels to cleaner fuels where that exists, you're also thinking about how you grow that demand, right? Because you are now industrializing. Those two types of transitions are very, very different, because the second one, which is the vertical transition that we see happening in a lot of developing economies in places like Africa, requires that you are growing your economy at the same time as shifting your energy system at the same time. So it's a very, very costly transition, and it's very different from what you have in an advanced economy. And so when you have, for instance, a grid system which is not as matured, when you have a grid system that is not able to manage high levels of renewables, once you actually bring in renewables into a grid, because it is variable and intermittent, it's weather dependent sometimes, you tend to introduce a lot of instability into the grid. And so all of that requires you to have grids which are very, very well developed, which are sophisticated, where you're able to balance those loads with the intermittent supply. You can't do that in economies where the grids are weak, where the grids are underdeveloped, and where the grid infrastructure is completely outdated. And so that brings a challenge in terms of what we can actually do, even if you had, ample and vast amounts of solar or wind on the continent. Infrastructure becomes a bottleneck. So that's the second on infrastructure. The third point I want to make is on finance. How do we pay for all of this? So in the African continent, most of the fiscally constrained countries are also the most vulnerable to climate change. So we say that, a lot of the low-income countries in Africa are going to require some up to about 21% of their GDPs to implement their nationally determined contributions. The nationally determined contributions are the voluntary commitments that countries made to whatever. So country A comes and says, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4 to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which were adopted in 2015, I believe. And this is not cheap. Some of it is talking about shifts in energy systems, in agricultural systems, So countries need funds to be able to do this. And the poorer you are, the bigger the chunk of the GT or GTP, which you potentially need to put into implementing these NDCs. And there are other issues, with financing in Africa. I talked about all those development goals outside of energy. Currently, the continent has about a 1.8 trillion financing gap for meeting a sustainable development goals by 2030. We need to be able to draw that up quickly. That's not even related to climate necessarily, just looking at our sustainable development goals alone. And to be able to achieve universal access to electricity by 2030, African countries, the African continent will need up to 25 to 30 billion invested annually through to 2030. That means that we need to increase current investment levels by 7 to 8 times to be able to achieve these goals. Also on renewable energy alone, we've only seen, a 20% growth, basically seen a 20% growth in a 2% global investment in renewable energy coming into the African continent with significant regional disparities. So you see that a lot of the financing is going to maybe places like South Africa, to Kenya, maybe to Nigeria. What happens to the rest of the 51, 48 countries that do not receive some of these, this support? Inflation rate is around 15.5%. In fact, a lot of African economies are having deep struggles with inflation. Most countries are considered to be, in some kind of debt distress at different levels. Some are at high risk, some but they're at some level of risk in terms of debt distress across the African continent. And we are unfortunately seeing a decline in the share of foreign direct investment, especially in greenfield investment. And when I talk about greenfield investments, I'm talking about those investments that go into financing, new infrastructure or something new which didn't exist. We are seeing a drop in those types of investments since it fell to its lowest in 2021. It's now just at 6% compared to about 61% in high-income countries and about 70% in developing Asia. So we are seeing a constriction of the finance that could fund the energy transition and sustainable development in Africa in general. And then another point is that, the cost of capital is high. What that means is that for an average energy project in Africa, you are going to be paying about 7 times more for the same project than you would in Europe or in North America. And there are several reasons for that. Sometimes investors have ideas of perceived, and there are some real risks with there's currency risk devaluation, the risk of currency devaluation. There are issues of institutional stability, having an enabling environment for investment. So all of that affects the cost of investing on the African continent, further limiting, the potential amounts of funds that you could have to invest in the energy transition. So I made this point already. This is looking at, the comparative shares of greenfield foreign direct investment by world regions. You realize that the African continent is that green line over there, and it's been falling quite steadily over the years compared to what you see in the high-income countries. Again, we are seeing foreign direct investments quite skewed. I mentioned this. You realize that about 10 key countries within the African continent account for the lion's share of the investment. So Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Ghana, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Angola, and Kenya. tend to receive the lion's share of these investments. Currently, the EU is estimated to be contributing, say, 34, 35%. The US is doing about 8% of FDI investments into the African continent. And they also tend to be skewed in terms of what businesses want to focus on as well. In the renewable energy sector, in fact, most of the FDI, which was going into the African continent, has still been largely focused on coal, oil, and gas. That's where most of the investments were going. Around the COVID era, we began to see an uptick, renewable energy basically overtaking the investments in coal, oil, and gas because we saw those global declines, right, in oil prices. But this has been the trend. And when we also look at, global philanthropy, that's, foundations and, people giving, to support climate action out of their own free will, we also realize that it's also still very largely focused on the US and EU. So over 60% of philanthropy funds still go to advanced economies. Africa is like 6%. So we see that there's a huge disparity in terms of where the financing goes. And we need to begin to rethink this in the context of the potential impact down the line in the next 25 years, in the next 70 years. As we hit the turn of the century, are we making enough investments to make sure that the African continent is climate ready? And then I think finally I'll talk about institutional investments before I go to run through some solutions. Institutional investments, the same. Africa receives the least share of venture capital, equity financing, investment from pension funds and insurance companies compared to other parts of the world in Latin America and in Asia. So what can we do? We've run through a couple of challenges. This is where I'm hoping we can kind of engage a bit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. But we need to begin to think about how we localize knowledge development and innovation on the African continent in general. Local knowledge to guide local actions, which are grounded in local perspectives of what we need to be able to build a foundation for a clean energy future on the African continent. One that's, is also able to highlight the critical role of development in achieving climate goals. We need to begin thinking about how we mobilize more domestic financing to support climate action and development on the African continent. It's obvious that the outflows into the continent are still very, very minimal. But when we look at the sources of revenue within the African continent, most of it is still coming from government revenue. So how can we increase that share of the pie to increase the fiscal space that governments have and reduce the debt burdens when they are taking on all these external funds? And then we need to invest in upgrading and building new power infrastructure. I talked about that into quite some detail. And then we also need to work more to build an understanding of the risks that shape the market environment on the continent and think about how we can integrate our markets a bit more so that the opportunities become more tangible. And then, of course, improving institutional and governance structures in Africa. So I'll close on this. Based on understanding of the challenges of the energy transition in Africa, CATF's work is modeled to respond very directly to some of these challenges. We have 4 pillars of work. The first one is working with local African researchers and building a coalition of researchers who are able to look and basically generate more knowledge around Africa's energy transition from an African perspective. We focus a lot on technology innovation. What are the opportunities for Africa to play a role in the next generation of climate technologies? Is Africa ready for this? Which workforce development is needed to prepare the continent to be able to participate in the climate economy as we move forward? We see a critical role for the power sector, and so we engage with power utilities in both East and West Africa on how we can improve performance so that utilities are able to meet their needs. We are working with utilities to understand the implications of renewables integration into their grids and how their grids can be more prepared to take up, these alternative sources of energy. And then generally on thought leadership and policy advocacy, just working with our network of partners on the continent to develop the thought leadership that helps to reframe the discussion around the energy transition in Africa. Basically around the conversations we are having here today to ground it more in African realities. And making the case for that when we have the opportunity to engage in global spaces like the Conference of Parties, which are held every year at the Regional Climate Weeks, and through other platforms which we put together ourselves. So I think I will end there so that we have some 10 minutes or so also for questions, if possible.
We have quite a while for discussion, so I'm excited to ask some more questions. Our first question is, how do we balance the justice issues surrounding wanting to rapidly improve quality of life for people in the global South without repeating the same damage we have caused and are continuing to cause in the US and Europe?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think one of the and in my work, one of the biggest challenges I see is really goes really to the crux of this question that you've raised in terms of the justice implications, of how we think about addressing climate change. And so if you, I don't know how familiar you all are with the conversations maybe over the last 5 years, which have been in the climate space around, who is responsible and whether or not, the poorer parts of the world should be taking part in this at all. This is not an old contradiction, right? Or an old tension, rather I should say. I remember that initially with the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, it was the US and China basically also tussling over the same thing as to whether or not, China should do anything but what do we see today? We saw China say, I wasn't going to do anything. And today we see China at the forefront of the development of clean energy technologies in wind and solar. And so I think that what the justice dimension does to the conversation and what it's supposed to do is for us to be able to come to the point and the recognition of the fact that the energy transition is going to be different and look different in every part of the world. Even in Africa, as I showed with the graph that I projected, the energy transition in Kenya is nothing compared to is nothing like the energy transition in a place like Nigeria, right? In Kenya, you have a country which has huge amounts of geothermal. Over 90% of Kenya's electricity today is clean. You go to Nigeria, huge dependence on oil and gas, not just for energy generation, but the whole economy is driven by exports of fossil fuels. And so we need to come to what I call more contextualized pathways for thinking about the energy transition and to work with countries to develop strategies that actually work for the country's economies. Nobody wants to collapse their economy to be able to stop the impacts of climate change, whether it's in the US or in Europe or in Africa. Nobody wants to do that. And I think that there's a space for us as a climate community to work with countries to basically come to the table with a recognition of the challenges that pertain to their very, very unique context, right? And to know that we are also not going to achieve this on the same timeline. For some countries, 2050 is going to be possible. The truth is that for some countries, it's not going to be possible. So for those countries, what do we do and how do we position them to be able to achieve that? And I think a third dimension of the justice perspective, I would say, is that if we indeed have a finite planet, right, and a finite space within which we can actually emit, then it means that those who have actually emitted a lot in the past in the advanced economies should really think about also ramping down those emissions really seriously. And unfortunately, we haven't seen emissions decline, even though we've been at climate action for maybe now a quarter of a century now. But we need to come to a space where we actually accept that historical responsibility and also work to actually basically, because it's like a finite pie, right? So I have to take a bit less for others to develop somewhat. And so that is also going to be an important recognition that as some of the poorer countries grow, we may see an uptick in emissions, but maybe that's an opportunity for those in the advanced economies to ramp down as well, rather than insisting, on consuming at the same level. So that's also another perspective that I'll throw out there as well.
Yeah, and I can see how there is some uncertainty in the transition in from energy sources, like going from renewable energy to, or sorry, that would be backwards, going from fossil fuel based energies to renewable energies. So we had one question that asks, what can we do about the health impacts of cooking with charcoal while we wait for the energy transition? Basically meaning, um, like what does it mean to be in that transition? How can we support our communities while we are going towards renewable energy?
Yeah. And thank you, Robin, for that question. I just actually opened my chat and saw it too. But that's, this is actually one of the most important challenges that we have on the African continent. And it's going to amaze you, Elijah, that sometimes we have climate conversations where nobody talks about cooking, because it doesn't really feature in, when we think about those emissions, we are thinking about the coal-fired power plants, right? Nobody's thinking about cooking and the fact that it's actually the biggest driver, even of climate emissions, even before we talk about the health impacts, that it's actually the biggest driver of climate emissions. And then there are the health impacts of cooking with charcoal, and even with sometimes even not charcoal, but just burning fuel wood for cooking. I believe that electrification of cooking is going to be an endpoint. I think that for some places in Africa, there's a need for us to think carefully about whether there could be a transitional role for LPG for cooking, for the cooking sector within Africa. And I think that it could significantly actually make change or make some improvements in terms of the health impacts of cooking, if we can actually make that fuel switch. It's been a challenge addressing this in the climate space because some environmentalists don't even want to hear about anything natural gas at all. But I go back to my earlier comment about the fact that the transition is going to look very different in different places around the world. And in some places, it might actually mean that we think of this transitional role for cooking with LPG on the way to fully electrified cooking. Because even if we electrify cooking today without fixing the challenges with infrastructure that we have on our grids, there might be no power. And that's what's happening. People have no power and then they go back to charcoal and to firewood for cooking. And so I think there's basically, I feel that we need to think about some transitional steps on the way to fully electrifying how we cook. But we even need also a deeper understanding from a research perspective of the health impacts of cooking alone. There are so many numbers thrown out there, but I think if we could paint a good picture of how those health impacts, together with the actual climate impacts, are negative for the African continent as a whole, we could be able to drive some support for some of these initiatives. But unfortunately, I've worked in this space for some time, and most of the time we talk about climate and everybody is just looking at, the power sector and what's coming out of those smokestacks, and nobody is thinking about how Africans cook. But I think that we need to be able to elevate that conversation right up to the top, if we are going to make any headway, both with addressing climate change, but the health impacts of cooking, the air pollution implications, significantly important as we think about climate impacts as well.
So then in different African regions and communities where it's very diverse and different, how are how do those transitions in cooking and health involved in like transitioning energy, how are they different? What are the extremes that you might describe?
Well, I think that when we talk about cooking, that is actually a space where you actually find many similarities as you move across different African continents. And so in a place like Kenya, for instance, where the grid is very clean and fairly clean, I think they have over 90% of renewables currently. The challenge with cooking there is not that, you don't have a clean grid. The challenge is with cooking is whether or not you're going to have that electricity available when you want to use your electric stove or your electric cooker. So that it goes to a question of infrastructure, right? If you moved to another place like Nigeria, where there's a much heavier dependence on fossil fuels, you have the same challenges, right, with infrastructure and the fact that the lights are just not on. Almost everybody in Nigeria is just running generators because their grid doesn't work. So I think when it comes to the cooking sector, especially when we think about electrifying cooking, then you realize that the infrastructural challenge that I mentioned even comes to play the more because people just don't have those electrons running into their kitchens to cook. And so the options we run to are charcoal and fuel wood. And usually the differences you would see would be around the rural urban divide. So most of the people in the urban areas are going to perhaps use more charcoal, and then those in the rural areas are going to be using more of the fuel wood because they are collecting them directly from forests or from whichever areas to do their cooking. But I think that and it's a great question because there's a very universal feel to what it means, which is an infrastructure challenge. But again, in places where you can begin to see nuances will be if you have, for instance, if we could actually, instead of venting, all the gas that comes from, the oil fields in Nigeria, if we could actually capture it, which would be good for the planet, good for methane emissions, and we could actually then pipe it into homes where people could then make a switch from using charcoal to rather using the gas for cooking. So in that case, those economies that have, an oil-based economy then have an advantage because if we could actually stop the flaring and actually capture the gas and pipe them into homes, then we could actually see some added benefits because certainly it's better to use the LPG than to burn charcoal and fuel wood. Yeah,
Yes,
Danny.
thinking about this, like the effects of this, like adapting to climate change as in terms of health and cooking for individual people is uh, really interesting to me because I don't normally think of that. I hear in the news, like I'm sure as we all are, countries, economies that are um, like people are unified under a country, or maybe it's only the government that we see. So it's really good to talk about those like individual uh, families that are affected the same way around the world and um, well, affected in different ways, although we should share how we can.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is why it's so critical that we think even about how we localize the knowledge generation process. Because trust me, when knowledge is developed in local spaces, right? You'd be amazed at what you will learn about how people make choices and why they make those choices. And you see a very, very complex but interesting interplay between the first, it's not just environmental emissions, right? This is a question of development and underdevelopment, which is actually driving emissions, some type of emissions in a particular country. And actually, what it even goes to is the fact that if you are serious about addressing climate change in Africa, it means we have to address underdevelopment immediately, because people are using dirtier fuels because of poverty. That's just what it is. Governments don't have the grit they should have because we are not investing in the grit as much as we should. Sometimes demand is too small, so utilities just can't make as much as they should make to be able to reinvest into the grid. So you begin to see that, it's not just about it's not just about CO2 emissions, but it's a very complex relationship with levels of development and how that in turn affects the types of CO2 emissions that you see within a continent, and even affects their ability to be able to build a future which is clean. So we need to broaden the conversation. I hope I can leave you with that today, that let's broaden the conversation. Climate change is emissions, but we will be able to come to climate change and come to addressing climate change, not only by shifting our energy systems, but in some places by taking development and the development head on, and making sure that we are bringing countries to a position when they can invest in the future that they want to have, and places where poverty does not become, or basically cause more harm to the climate than we would otherwise have.
So yeah. Um, so then I'm curious, as we're like looking to every person on Earth, like not just governments, to support this changing climate, like this the adaptations to climate change. Are there citizen-based, or let's see, how do I call it? I would say citizen-based research projects that involve people in the community in research to submit data or take part in that research.
Absolutely. Yeah. So now we are thinking about very, very diverse ways of collecting information from people about, patterns of energy use. We just recently did a study in Kenya where we were so Kenya is seeing an introduction of electric bikes, right? So we did a study, citizens-based study, as you said, collected information from people who are riding these electric bikes, trying to understand um, how are people making decisions as to whether or not to use electric bikes? What are their challenges with charging infrastructure? And how are they basically? What does this look like from an end user perspective? And so we have a lot of that going on. There are a lot of initiatives that try to crowdsource information about energy use patterns using mobile phones, because everybody has a mobile phone, even in places where you don't have the grid, right? So we have an opportunity with, the expansion of mobile technology to collect information in very, very diverse ways to help us understand patterns of energy use. And there are so many of these going on around there, of projects collecting information on behavioral aspects of this, collecting information on, just technical components, technical aspects of energy use, all using, mobile phones and other ways of collecting data. But yeah, I'm happy to engage more on that. I know we are running out of time, but happy to talk more about some of those examples, and hopefully maybe we can talk again sometime with you all. But thank you for having me today.
Of course. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. Um, that was super awesome. The conversation with you following your presentation helped me understand a lot more about the finance and um, the economy that I didn't uh, think about for um, our adaptations to climate change. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm happy to hear that. So, thanks for the invitation, and it's been a pleasure engaging with you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. And if you would, real quick, if you would like to stick around for um, our other speaker presentations, we will be going until 4 o'clock, I think, across our two rooms. And just
Okay.
some background information about our symposium. Our next speaker is in this room, Nishad Shafi, and in the next room, Dr. Frederick W. Miller.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Will do.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
And so as we transition to our next room, we are waiting for our speaker to join. I'm checking to see if so what did you all think about that last presentation on the economy of adapting to climate change in Africa? A lot of the um, business and research communication was a little over my head, but I'm grateful that we had that like the discussion at the end.
I was surprised by the impact of cooking. And also pleased to hear that it seems like there are solutions on the horizon for that. I was also surprised to see the diversity in sustainable or renewable energy use across the region. I was not aware of that. That surprised me.
Yeah, I think we all share that. And I would like to, oh, we're still